afternoon and welcome to the Majurity Conversations 2021. Philanthropy, the way forward. My name is Charlotte May and I will be your host for the afternoon. Now, the next 2 hours are going to fly by as we dive into conversations that will get us thinking differently about how we get by this year and thrive in the years ahead. Now, much like we have all had to adapt to change when COVID struck, this stage right here, this incredible extended reality studio by Ox Media was also born out of the need to innovate when COVID struck. So what's next for us in the charity and philanthropic space? I would now like to invite on stage Mr. Martin Tan, CEO of the Majurity Trust, to share his opening address. Martin, please.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Guest of honor, Speaker Tan Chuan Jin, Ms. Anita Pham, President NCSS, Dr. John Lee, Country CEO and CEO of Maybank Singapore, partners, friends, good afternoon and welcome to the Majurity Conversations 2021. 2 years ago, we met at the Drama Center for our very first Majurity Conversations, talking about the person, passion, and purpose behind doing good with keynote speaker Scott Harrison, founder and CEO of Charity Water, and Dr. Goh Wei Leong, founder of HealthServe. This year, we're delighted to welcome Wes Moore, CEO of Robin Hood Foundation in New York, as our keynote speaker, together with our esteemed panelists to talk about philanthropy, the way forward. 2 years ago, we held the Majurity Conversations in conjunction with the official launch of the Majurity Trust. This year, we are holding the Majurity Conversation in conjunction with the official launch of the Maybank Momentum Grant. 2 years ago, we met in person. This year, we're meeting on Zoom. Life as we know it has changed since 2020. For one, orange is no longer just a fruit, circuit breaker is no longer just an electrical safety feature, and we will no longer take toilet paper for granted, ever. What hasn't changed, however, is that life continues to affect different ones of us differently. Charles Dickens, in his book, The Tale of Two Cities, probably put it best, though I think centuries apart. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. 2020 was such a time. We saw our vulnerable communities hit the most, and with new gaps surfaced, but at the same time, we've also seen greater level of support ever given. It was a time we saw the collective giving of Singaporeans go up, but also one of the deepest decline in fundraising for many of our charities, particularly the smaller ones. If 2020 is to teach us anything, it is that no one agency alone can help solve the problem we face as a nation. Not government alone, not the social sector alone, not the corporates or philanthropists alone. But collectively, we can face any challenge thrown our way. Many of you attending today have been a part of our collective journey of building thriving communities for all in Singapore. Our donors, key partners like Tote Board, MCCY, MSF, NCSS, amongst others, grantees, volunteers. Together, you responded to the needs on the ground that came fast and furious. You were there in the dormitories supporting our migrant communities before the crisis took root. You created learning content that parents can use with their children when circuit breaker happened. You sang home in unison, over 900 of you, to lift the spirits of a nation. It was truly SG strong. It was truly SG together. It was truly SG united. But as consuming as COVID was, regular societal issues remained critical to be supported, and our donors responded. Palm Oil Giant Museum Mars gave $1 million last year to seed the Blue Star Fund that focused on preventing youth depression and suicide. We launched the Silver is Gold Fund to widen support for persons living with dementia and their caregivers. Also, in partnership with the Financial Markets Association of Singapore, we raised over $500,000 for the ACI Trampoline Fund to support vulnerable individuals and families that need help to bounce back from the crisis. Unprecedented times also calls for innovative ways to address challenges differently. With the generous gift of $2 million from Maybank Singapore, and with the help of our friends at Tri-Sector Associates, we are today launching the Maybank Momentum Grant, a first-of-its-kind recyclable grant in Singapore that provides much-needed cash flow and capital support to young, promising charities that simply need a boost during these difficult times. We cannot thank Maybank enough for their unwavering support in making the Maybank Momentum Grant a reality. But more on that later. Together, we've raised over $6.6 million in 2020, supporting over 180 charities and ground-up initiatives, reaching over 360,000 beneficiaries. And we're happy to share that we are on track to reach 100% commitment rate for all our funds. All this are only possible because we did it collectively. So thank you to each and every one of you on this call and beyond for making 2020 the best of times during the worst of times. Today, we'll be talking about philanthropy, the way forward. We want to cast an eye on what the world will be like post-COVID and the role we can all play. What should donors be focusing on? What do donors want to see? How can charities and ground-up groups respond in this time? How can charities and philanthropies partner governments to build thriving communities in Singapore? That will be our conversation for today. To start us off, it is my great pleasure to welcome one of our heroes in the social sector, who himself had raised millions of dollars for the charity sector with his beautiful photography. Please join me in welcoming our guest of honor, Speaker Tan Chuan Jin, to give his guest of honor address. Speaker, please.
All right, thanks, Martin. Hello, a very good afternoon to all our friends out there. I know I'm preaching to the converted. Many of you are involved in the social space, in the philanthropic space, and doing whatever we can to make a difference, especially today amidst the COVID-19 situation. I know that we are going to discuss about the way forward, what we're going to do, the different things, the different initiatives. All these things are important, but perhaps what I'll take the opportunity to do is to revisit the fundamentals. Not so much about what we're going to do, how we're going to do it, where we're going to do it, but why are we doing it? It might seem painfully obvious. I think a lot of us assume that we're all on the same page, that we should move beyond that and let's really explore the details. The details do matter. But I find that it's useful to remind ourselves why exactly are we doing what we do and how vitally important I feel it is. Now imagine, I think many of us are very good, in Singapore particularly, we're very good at doing things, jump into the details. But the why part, I do ask that we spend a bit of time to reflect and remind ourselves and reinvigorate ourselves to remotivate and inspire ourselves about why this is so fundamentally important. Now, there are many things that we need to do in a country, whether it's keeping the economy going, which is important. It creates jobs for people. How do you deal with environmental issues, transport, education, etc., etc. Now, so I sometimes use the analogy of a strategy map. If you were to have a strategy map of Singapore, what would it look like? I know that many of us, when we are free, we don't sit down and start doodling what the strategy map of Singapore would look like. But imagine if there was on one page, or one PowerPoint slide, you were able to just pen down and draw out and sketch out all the different components that goes into keeping the country going, the things that we need to do, the mega trends that shape us, and perhaps at the foundational pieces, what's really core? What are the things that, what's the secret to our success that will ensure that whatever comes, whatever the future may hold, we would be able to deal with it. Now, so imagine in your own mind, what would that picture look like? And I just want to focus on the foundational pieces. What would be the key to our success? What's the secret to making sure that whatever the future holds, whether it's COVID-19, whether it's whatever crisis, are we able to deal with it and to achieve the outcomes that we want? So in my mind, people is the key to our success, and we all know that. It's a motherhood statement, but what is it about people? There's a competency part, how we are able to organize ourselves, our skills, our ability, how we deliver the outcomes. I mean, that's the part that I think many of us will be familiar with. We will spend our time organizing ourselves to do that, and we can't drop the ball on that, and it's fundamentally important. But there's another component which is, so that part I call the heart part. But the other part is really about the heart. It's about whether are we prepared to not just do the job and do the thing, but are we prepared to go the extra mile? Are we prepared to sacrifice for one another? Are we thinking more about we and not just me? Are we thinking more about the future and not just today? And I think intuitively all of us know that. In any organization, what makes a difference between a good and great organization is that you're not just functionally doing something, you're actually literally going the extra mile for each other, the team, for your boss, for the cause, for the purpose. And I think at the national level, it's the same thing. A people that begins to care about others and not just self, I think you begin to move to a very different dimension. In many countries, you're just running from pillar to post, from one election cycle to another. The demands of the public is basically how things benefit me today, here and now. That's human nature. But I think what makes us human is also the capacity to care, to have compassion, to have empathy, and how do you bring that out into practice? So how do you actually nurture this value in a society? Now, I don't think it's about government proclaiming and therefore a new set of national values, you recite it every day and it's going to happen. It's not. But I think the schools call it values in action today, and I think it's a very apt term. I'm not sure the schools necessarily get it right all the time. Some do it better than others, but values in action is exactly what it is. Values are realized in action. And it's really about the values of thinking about others, putting others before self. It's about love, compassion, empathy, whatever that comes to mind along those lines. And I think, don't we all feel that we do want a society, to live in a society like that, where we're not just looking out for the bottom line, but we are looking out for each other as well. So if indeed that is true, whether at the nation level, at a company level, then if that is indeed so, and that's a quality that we need to nurture, the heart and soul of our nation, then the question is, how do you bring that about? Is it just moral education, talking about it? In my mind, there's only one way in which we can realize this. From a secular perspective, religion, faith probably will play a part in it. But from a secular perspective, what's going to make a difference? The only platform that I know of is in giving. Not just money, but particularly time. When we volunteer, when we commit our lives into the lives of others, that's where I think we begin to have the opportunity to learn to be grateful. We will learn not to take things for granted. We learn to be circumspect about the things that we are preoccupied with. We learn to put into practice love, compassion, empathy, kindness. And if you think about it, what other ways do we have in a very non-prescriptive, non-preachy way to begin to instill those values in all of us? Which is why giving, volunteering, becomes vitally important. So the issues that we are grappling with today, which is in this space, it's a lot more important than you realize. Because for the social sector, it's not just about helping the disabled, the disadvantaged, the blind, the poor, etc., etc. It's an opportunity for us to bring on board the rest of society so that they can partake in that journey to make the difference, to improve the lives of those who are disadvantaged. But importantly, the KPI, if you would like to define it that way, is also about the transformative effect for the giver. Would every giver, every volunteer come out of that journey a changed person, a better person? Imagine if we define that as one of our key requirements. You begin to think about the whole philanthropic journey differently. You begin to think about the whole volunteering experience differently. You begin to actually care about how that change effect begins to affect the volunteers and the giver themselves. I think it actually also adds to what we do because they become more committed, more regular, they're keen to do more, they begin to drag their family members along, their colleagues in the companies along. So why this is so important is because I think this is, as far as that I know of, that we can begin to build a fundamentally different society. And what is wonderfully empowering is that you don't even need to wait for government to do this. All of us in our own way can make the difference. Me, myself, my family, I can do that. If you're a captain of industry, you say that, you know what, I never thought of my CSR program that way, but maybe this is my contribution to building something very different. And perhaps if you then begin to embark on that journey where everyone in your company begins to partake in that experience, and you're also curating the experience so that they change. One company does that, another, and as it goes on, slowly but surely, society begins to change because society comprises individuals. And if we can see how individuals change, society changes along with us. And as more of us get involved on a regular basis, we can begin to program, we can begin to actively do preventive work. So whether for those who are disadvantaged in different ways, we can begin to be able to structurally make a difference to their lives as well. So it's a virtuous cycle in many ways. So I'll pretty much end off with that. I know that it might seem painfully obvious, but I think it's useful to remind ourselves why it is so very, very important for us to do this. Because I know of no other way in which our society can be different. And I think for us in Singapore, it's worth endeavoring to build a fundamentally different society, and it's all within our control. So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you, Speaker. Now, to tell us more about the generous gift by Maybank Singapore for promising charities, I would like to invite on stage Maybank Singapore's country CEO and CEO, Dr. John Lee. Dr. John, please.
Thank you, Charlotte. So, a very good afternoon, Mr. Tuan Chuan Jin, Speaker of the Parliament of Singapore, Mr. Martin Tan, CEO of Majurity Trust, distinguished guests and friends who are tuning in this afternoon. It is with great pleasure that Maybank is here at the Majurity Conversation and to launch the Maybank Momentum Grant. Allow me to share our vision of what the Maybank Momentum Grant is with you. First, let me start with the why. I'm sure we all remember how we lived through last year with so much uncertainty. Every day, we were overwhelmed with news of how the pandemic was taking its toll on lives and livelihoods. Like many others, we wanted to do something to help, but we wanted to do it in a longer-term way and go beyond just immediate pandemic relief. We asked ourselves, how can we make our contribution more impactful? It is around this time that we were seeing reports of how charities had been affected by drastic drop-off in donation, as fundraising activities were suspended and donations were mainly channeled to COVID-related causes. Small charities were the most affected, as they had lesser reserves and fewer resources, and yet many faced increasingly demand for their services during this period. Why are we concerned with small charities? Some of you may ask. In many ways, small charities are the startup of the social sector. They tend to be closer to the ground and have strong relationship with the service user and volunteers. This helps them to constantly get feedback on unmet needs and innovate ways to serve those needs. By virtue of being small, they are more agile and also willing to innovate. During this pandemic, and especially during the circuit breaker, we have seen the power of what small charities or even informal groups can achieve. When the idea of a recyclable grant came up to help these small charities, we did not hesitate to fund it. The Momentum Grant is a new way of grant making with 3 key features. 1, the grant provides an interest-free capital to support the charities' plan for growth and expansion. With our contribution of $2 million and administered by Majurity Trust, we aim to support up to 20 small charities over the next 2 years. With time, the charities will be able to build momentum and become more financially sustainable. They can repay the grant so it can be recycled to help other charities down the road. The multiplier of the impact of our philanthropy dollars and continue the virtual funding cycle. 2, we want to go beyond grant support and address some of the common challenges that this charity may face in a startup phase. There is to build their capacity and develop growth strategy. The Majurity Trust will arrange master classes for the grantees, and the Maybank will share our expertise and advise them on financial planning. 3, we rope in our retail SME banking team to provide grantees with a Maybank community package, which is a bundle of banking and digital services designed for charities. We will also find ways to make it easier for our customers to make contribution at a different touch point, such as donating their credit cards, cashback, or reward points to support this charity. So in conclusion, one of the biggest lessons we learned from COVID is how interconnected the world is and how we all have a part to play to keep society functioning well. If we can come together and lend our strengths to support the areas of needs, we can all become stronger and better together. The grantees that we will unveil shortly are known to punch above their weight during this pandemic. We are glad to be able to support them in their growth journey. This is one way we, hopefully in Maybank, live up to our mission of humanizing financial services. I hope you all enjoy the rest of the event, and I look forward to exchanging ideas with you and other panelists on the way forward for philanthropy in Singapore. Thank you, and have a good afternoon.
So here at the Greenhouse, what we've discovered is that in serving marginalized and vulnerable communities who are using drugs as a way of coping with pain, it's very important that we do not re-traumatize them, because there's a lot of stigma and discrimination out there.
The thing about mental health work is that we cannot rely on volunteers to do it. Very often we need trained personnel, and that's costly. And ultimately, at the end of the day, we're seeing huge numbers of young people coming in, and we don't have the manpower to handle that.
Children are still experiencing a lack of devices and a lack of internet. It's very easy to fall behind. The fact is that we need to provide not only digital solutions, but quality digital solutions, and we need to provide it now.
Securing this grant was definitely very timely. It gives us some runway to gain momentum, to build capacity.
We need more fundraisers to come on board to help bring in more income for the agency to expand the clinical team. And the Maybank Momentum Grant will help us do that.
The timing of this grant and the amount of this grant, it allows us to do our work not only well, but also do it now. If this grant wasn't around, I'll have to wait a couple more months, and then we'll lose a few more people down the way.
The concept of paying it forward is actually very familiar to all of us in recovery. Service to others is a big part of recovery. We are glad that Maybank and Majurity Trust believes that we are good people who want to get better. And once we are better, we want to be able to help other people get better.
There's a need to pay it forward, and we were once a young charity that struggled with money. So this will allow another young charity to grow up to do the amazing work that it was meant to do.
Now we are not only responsible for our own organization, but when we return the money, we are also responsible for every single grantee that comes after us so that they can grow.
We cannot just say how appreciative we are for Maybank's support, for their support for local promising charities during this time. Thank you so much, Dr. John. One of the biggest inspirations for our work at the Majurity Trust is that of Robin Hood Foundation. Founded over 30 years ago by Paul Tudor Jones, Robin Hood has been razor sharp in their focus on fighting poverty in New York City, giving out over $3 billion in grants, helping thousands upon thousands of New Yorkers. Using research and data, Robin Hood has been able to identify, seed fund, and scale some of the most effective poverty-fighting charities on the ground. In 2018, I had the privilege of spending 3 weeks with the team at Robin Hood, with Wes and his team in New York, learning from them what it means to reimagine philanthropy and how impact measurement through data can inform philanthropy in a big way. Our keynote speaker today is Wes Moore, CEO and Robin Hood Foundation, a veteran, a New York Times bestselling author. Wes' leadership over Robin Hood, especially during 2020, has been nothing short of inspirational. Let's take a look at the work Robin Hood did in 2020, and after that, over to you, Wes.
Rise Up New York, the virtual telethon to help New Yorkers impacted by the pandemic that we aired earlier tonight on Channel 7, was judged an amazing success.
$115 million. We did this. You did this. We are difference makers.
Keep the memory alive.
$115 million, a 1-hour special simulcast on stations, including ours, featured performances from New York area-based superstars, including, as you saw, Billy Joel, Mariah Carey there, Bon Jovi, and inspiring messages from so many other celebrities.
I'm a New Yorker, and you're New Yorkers too. And you know New York is going to rise again, because you've seen it all. Been through 9/11, Hurricane Sandy, crash of 2008, and we've always come out stronger and more resilient than ever before. We're going to do it again this time.
The great Bette Midler of the Robin Hood Foundation says the money will go toward a myriad of services to help New Yorkers rebuild their lives.
It is great to be with you, Martin. I am just so grateful for your friendship, for your leadership, how you continue to inspire us all. And so just thank you so much for having me. And thank you to the Majurity Trust. It's a very big deal for me to be here, and I'm incredibly grateful for all you do. My name is Wes Moore, and I'm the CEO of the Robin Hood Foundation. And Robin Hood for 32 years has really moved with one goal and one goal exclusively, and that is to end poverty in New York City. And when I think about it, where New York is and where Singapore is actually very similar type of frameworks. Where New Yorkers are and where many Singaporeans are actually very alike. And I say that because we're talking about areas and places. When people talk about New York, we talk about the big buildings. We talk about Broadway. We talk about the lights. We talk about the affluence, Wall Street and investment world. But oftentimes that doesn't share the whole story. And I think in Singapore, you have a very similar dynamic, where Singapore is considered a very wealthy nation, but poverty is escalating. And between 2012 and 2015, in just 3 years, the poverty rate increased by 43%. That according to economists and social researchers, poverty in Singapore appears most acute amongst the elderly, amongst the working poor, amongst the unemployed. Do you know what that sounds like? New York. where New York has a significant amount of affluence and a significant amount of mythology and hopefulness. But what New York also has is over the past 4 years before COVID-19, that half of the population of New York lived in poverty for at least a year over the past 4 years. Not half of a group, not half of a demographic. Half of the city lived in poverty for at least a year over the past 4 years. So we still do have an extraordinary place, but an extraordinary place that is a prime and a clear example of what it means to have the have and the have-nots. And one thing that happened 32 years ago under the leadership of Robinhood's founders, Paul Tudor Jones, Peter Boresh, a handful of others, David Saltzman, was they basically looked at it and said, you know, we know at this time it was 1988, we know this was going to be a tough year for the markets and a tough year for the city. But you know who this is really going to be tough on? It's really going to be tough on people who are living in poverty already. Because for people who are living in poverty, for people who do not have those access to opportunities, every year is a tough year. And so in that, they created Robinhood. And the Robinhood Foundation first started off allocating around $42,000 in grants to organizations. Now, Robinhood, 32 years later, has allocated north of $3 billion into the poverty fight. But it wasn't just about the amount of capital. It wasn't just the number. That wasn't what made Robinhood Robinhood. Really what made Robinhood Robinhood was the fact of we wanted to look differently about the way philanthropy is actually done. We wanted to be essentially venture philanthropy. Because we're talking about people who are all involved in the business community, all involved in the business world. And they said, you know what? We don't make our investments based on ideas and just, you know, and marketing. We look at data. We look at information and about how information should help to guide our investment principles and our investment philosophies. Well, they looked at their philanthropy the same way, where they said, we should not be making our philanthropic decisions based on who is the cutest kids on the cover of their annual report. We should use data and we should use metrics. So one of the core key components that Robinhood helped to build out was how exactly to use data, how exactly to use metrics to better understand and to better analyze how we should be thinking about putting together the most effective portfolio when it comes to philanthropy and philanthropic organizations. Another core component when we talk about venture philanthropy is how exactly we can build capacity for nonprofits through management assistance. That oftentimes what organizations need, it is not just capital, it is just not just liquidity, it is not just checks. What they need oftentimes is management assistance, support for their social entrepreneurs, how to help with things like balance sheet management, how to help with things like partnership and legal and accounting, all these things that make organizations work well, all these things that help an organization go from good to great, all these things that help leaders be able to better tackle the problems that we were trying to tackle. And then the other pieces that we then had to be able to do was really think hard and think critically about how philanthropy can be leveraged to do more than just simply be capital allocators. How do we use research in the most important and compelling ways? How do we make sure that data and information and statistics that are out there, for example, like the one that I mentioned before about how many New Yorkers are living in poverty, that's with research that we do in partnership with Columbia University through an element that we built called the Poverty Tracker. And we now use that data not just to inform our own work, but we use that data to inform the way we're speaking with other organizations, nonprofits, and governments. How then do we also move in partnership in everything that we do? Move with the community in everything that we do? Recently, we started an initiative called the Power Fund, which is exclusively focused on funding organizations that are led by people of color because there is such a disparate distinction between that. And how do we leverage policy in a really powerful and important way? How do we come up with, help to craft policies and work with lawmakers to know that it's research and it's vetted solutions that are community-led, that are going to get us to a better place, and that we know that government cannot do it all alone, that philanthropy plays an incredibly important role in all this. But we also know that philanthropy can't do it all alone either, that we need partners and we need collaborators. You know, I think about this in context of my journey into Robinhood, where I did not realize until I became the CEO of Robinhood that one of the first neighborhoods that Robinhood invested in was one of the neighborhoods that I grew up in. Well, I was born down in Maryland, which is close to Washington, D.C. My father died in front of me when I was young. And my mother had a very difficult time with the transition because instantaneously she became a widow in her 20s, and she was going to raise these 3 kids on her own, and this was not the life that she had prepared for or the life that she had expected. My mother was having a really difficult time with the transition. She finally called up her parents, my grandparents, and said that she needed help. And they gave her the answer that she was hoping that they would give, which is bring the kids up here and we can help. And almost immediately as I got up there, I found myself getting lost. Almost immediately as I got up there, I found myself living and existing in a neighborhood that oftentimes felt neglected. And the reason it felt neglected is because that it was. I immediately found myself in situations where I was being spoken to by our larger society about what was expected of me without them having to say a word. If you just simply looked at our neighborhoods and the neighborhoods that existed around us, everything from the water people were drinking to the air they were breathing, to the food deserts that people were forced to exist in, to the lack of educational opportunities, to the way people were policed. Every aspect around us was a reminder of poverty and the reminder of the weight of inequity. And right around the same time that I got up there, right around the same time that I was getting a very distinct and a daily reminder that things were not easy, nor simple, nor fair, an organization was being built called Robinhood. And one of the first places that Robinhood started investing in was the place that I called home. And so having a chance to be its leader, having a chance to be its CEO, in many ways is not just an incredibly professionally fulfilling experience to be able to work on issues that I've spent my entire adult life working on. It's also a chance to serve as a distinct reminder of the importance of involvement and engagement and us caring and us being able to do the work that we have to do to be able to solve and deal with a very human pain. We saw that human pain on full display over the past year. We saw how in New York City alone, New York ended up being one of the fastest hit places in the United States, where even in early days, we now just passed the year commemoration of when we closed our offices, where we had a couple members of our team get sick early. We're in New York when you started looking at the numbers rising so quickly. We're in New York then very quickly turned around, and we saw 11 years of job growth go away in 11 weeks. We saw in many ways the heartbeat of New York, the things that make New York so unique and distinct and powerful. Our hospitality industry, our restaurants, our hotels shut down. And the heartbreaking thing about that was not just about what it meant for people who are coming in, where would they stay and where would people eat? And, New York's got some of the best restaurants in the world. It's also who works there. It's also who employs them. When you're looking at the hospitality industry, for example, the hospitality is some of the largest employers of our population, of the working poor, the ones who are washing the dishes and serving the coffee, changing the bed sheets. People who, even before COVID-19, found themselves wrestling with this beast of poverty. Understanding the fact that in the United States, 24% of people who lost their jobs due to COVID-19 were people who were living in poverty before COVID-19, i.e., the working poor. And so what we did during this time period was we very quickly found ourselves having to move. We very quickly found ourselves having to think through what is the greatest need that we can serve, while at the same time dealing with the long-term consequences and dealing with poverty as a chronic challenge, but also knowing there's a very human and immediate need that we had to address. And so just in that time period, just in these months, in these past 9 months, Robinhood launched a relief fund, where what we began to see as we started, it's only the third time in the history of the organization that we've actually launched a relief fund. The first time was after 9/11, the second time was after Hurricane Sandy, and the third time was now. But where we now have raised north of $70 million and have allocated now already 94% of that to go out to the most human and immediate need that we see in our communities. And because of the widespread touch that we have, the fact that we have organizations that we support in all 5 boroughs, over 1,000 every single year, we know exactly who to go to make sure the money is getting allocated and getting to the people who were most in need. So we created this relief fund, which really had a couple distinct goals. One was on how do we fortify the social service sector, which was getting hit so hard and so distinctly by this crisis. The second piece was just on emergency cash assistance, just by making sure we were getting cash in people's hands, because one thing that we were seeing, even when you saw government intervention, that millions of people were being left out. And so we found it our distinct purpose and our distinct responsibility to be able to help fill that void, to be able to close that gap for people who needed it most in that moment. During the same period of time, we also launched the platform that I spoke about before, called the Power Fund. It was looking at the fact that there's been about a 400% increase in philanthropic giving over the past 20 years. And during that same time period, only about 10% of it has gone to organizations that are led by people of color, led by African Americans, led by Latinos, led by Asian Americans. And so we started looking at the number and looking at the disparities and thinking to ourselves, well, not only does it show that there's still measures of systemic bias that exist, not just in private capital, not just in the private sector, but in philanthropy as well. But it also showed that it didn't make sense, because it's our core and distinct philosophy that it's the people who are closest to the challenge will be the ones who are closest to the solutions. They are just hardly ever at the table. And so we created this Power Fund, which was an initiative that was exclusively focused on how do we build out the mechanisms, the capital support, but then also the management assistance support for our organizations that are led by people of color who are focusing on the same exact issue, because I am willing to make a bet that if we can do that, we can move ourselves closer to being able to find the solutions we're all yearning for. And we started leaning in more and creating and increasing our partnership with policymakers, understanding that when you're looking at why poverty exists, it's important for all of us to be able to have a coordinated and a consolidated role in being able to address human pain when we see it. And that does not just mean government. It does not just mean philanthropy. It means all of us working in concert. And I want to close out very quickly, with with I just lost my earplug, with having a conversation. And I was thinking about when I was younger, and I was actually sent to a military school because of some of the challenges that I saw in New York when I was growing up. And we had a colonel in that military school, a person who, after I was sent there when I was 13 years old. And he was very, very tough and very strict and very fair, though. And we loved him. And he loved us back. But we noticed he was losing weight very quickly. And we found out that the reason he was losing weight so quickly is because he was diagnosed with cancer. And he had to leave the school. And he gave a speech to us one day, which turned out to be his farewell address. It was the last time he talked to the Corps Cadets. It was the last time we saw him. And he said something to us that day that I will not forget. He just simply said, when it's time for you to leave here, when it's time for you to leave this school, when it's time for you to leave your job, when it's time for you to leave your neighborhood, or when it's time for you to leave this planet, make sure that it mattered that you were ever even here. Make sure that it mattered that you were ever even here, because none of us are promised anything. We're not promised more days, weeks, or years. So the thing is that while we're here, let's do something special. While we're here, let's build. While we're here, let's come up with a new way that philanthropy can help realize. A new world that philanthropy can help to seed. A new place that philanthropy can help lead us to. Because we know that there's not one singular institution that is responsible for the level and the measures of inequity we have in society. There's no single institution that's going to get us out of this. So the only thing that we can do while we are doing it is to do everything we can do, is to push hard, is to continue doing exactly what you all are doing, while there's not a long history of philanthropy in Singapore. Knowing that the future of it, the stories around it, will be written by you. And that's exactly what our society needs now. So I'm grateful to be with you, Martin, always, and to all of you. And thank you for the work you're doing at the Majurity Trust.
Wow. That was, I just think about that last part where you're talking about make sure it matters while you are here. That's so true for different ones of us on this call, on this stage, the audiences at home, their philanthropists, donors, social sector leaders, government leaders. It is so true that the amount of time we have, how can we make it count? How can we make it matter? If COVID is to teach us anything, and we hope we learn a lot of lessons, it's just how interconnected we are globally, among society, among friends, but how interdependent we are. So I really do want to say how inspired and how thankful I am for what you guys are doing all these 32 years. One of the conversations about that we are having is about the way forward. Your time at Robin Hood, you have seen some major shifts. You have led some really big changes within the organization itself. I thought I would start our conversation there. What to you were the biggest shift, you think, in New York, in America, in the West, when it comes to philanthropy? We've talked about how important data is. We talked about how important research is to philanthropists to know where to give, what to ask. But in your opinion, has there been a shift, especially with COVID, with the Power Fund, with the Relief Fund that you've started? What is some of the biggest shift you have observed among philanthropists, or what philanthropists are looking for?
Great question. I think some of the biggest shifts that we're seeing is there's really kind of twofold. One is there's an old expression, not about us, with us. And I think philanthropy is really taking hold of this idea of not about us, with us, and where we can't make our decisions with any degree of clarity or any degree of conviction that it's going to work if we are not deeply involving the community in the decision-making process. That if we are just speaking down on high about what communities need and what communities should do, as if we have the answers, then the altruism that we might be even trying to approach the work with will be viewed as something else by the community that serves the recipients. And so I think there is a real shift when we have in the way that philanthropy is working, is we have to do a better job of having a more inclusive voice, a more inclusive decision-making process, a more inclusive process in terms of how we think about things like power and autonomy and who's at the table and who's not. All of these are things that I think evolutions of philanthropy is continuing to go through. And I think we've made real strides as an organization, but I know it's something that as an organization, we have to continue pushing on. The second piece, though, is I think it's something about the role of policy, where, it goes back to this question of when you ask people, why do you think poverty exists? And, people can say, well, it's a lack of opportunity and we have to do the X better, we have to do Y better. And all that is all true. But here's the truth, is that poverty exists because of policies. Because there are policies that have allowed people to fall into poverty and allowed people to stay there. And so part of our role is in this collection of data information, in being venture philanthropists, is we essentially look at ourselves oftentimes as risk capital, right? We look at what we do essentially saying, very similar with private investments, saying, our capital should be patient, but our capital should not be permanent. We shouldn't just become line items, right? What we want to do is find what are the most innovative ideas. What are the things that we know are going to be interesting to work on? But we also know for government and for other larger entities, it might be a little too early for them, right? The risk appetite for them is different than what the risk appetite should be for us. And that's okay. So we play our role. Our role is to find and fund the most innovative ideas that have potential for scale. And we can give them the capital energy. We can give them the boost to be able to really test out what are the things that we have to do that if it works, we now have something we can pass off to our governmental partners, and we can say, we have de-risked this. This works. We've shown it, we funded it, but now it's ready for scale. And that's something that I think becomes an important mechanism about how philanthropy continues to adjust itself in this moment and then beyond.
That's very cool. Because venture philanthropy includes that risk capital. Was it difficult trying to convince philanthropists, convince donors to say, hey, you join us in giving to this fund or giving to this organization, but we will have to take some risk? Was it a difficult journey trying to convince donors to be able to take that sort of risk?
It was something where I think one is we built a history of trust with donors, where donors know that we use data and metrics. We don't make emotive decisions. Right? We use data to be able to come with the landing that we're looking for on many of the decisions that we're then going to make. So I think there was that sense of both continuity and comfort with donors, with us, with our model, with how we do our work. And that was hard earned and that took time. But I think the other thing was this, is that we actually really wanted to have that conversation not about this, but have it with donors. And to say, one of the things about philanthropy and the way that philanthropy is even allocated, even if you look at the tax benefit in the United States, that philanthropy oftentimes is treated as arbitrage for investors, right? Where because you just make your philanthropic gift, you then get the benefit for it, right? You win automatically because I made the donation to the organization. I get the tax benefit for making the donation to the organization. The organization does good work and they do what they need to do. It's like a win-win-win, right? The problem and what we wanted to drive home with our base is that, but who it's not always a win-win-win for is the community. The community needs to be the one who understand and see this as a complete win-win-win. And so this is what it means to not just make sure that we're making really good grants and supporting really good organizations and bolstering really good social entrepreneurs, but also it is about having core conversations about how can we then influence policies that are making the lives of our community better. Influencing policies that are going to decrease and hopefully at some point eliminate that burden of poverty. That's how we wanted to think about it. And so it really did come down to, for almost like from a private sector understanding, who's our end user in all of this? And how do we make sure that our end user is bought in to both the thesis and bought into the conclusions of what we're trying to get done?
That is so true, right? Because without that understanding, and sometimes one of the things I treasured about my time with you guys in New York was to see the relationship you have with the partners on the ground. I remember going to Flushing, I remember going with your guys to see some of the grantees that you have. And the common refrain that when I talk to the grantee is that they love the partnership they have with Robin Hood because you guys understand what they're going through. And I think that risk capital that you're talking about also give them the permission to innovate, to create, and to really come out with the most effective and most innovative organization. So that's probably one of the most important things I took away from my time with you guys. I know as all good things, time flies very fast, and our time for this conversation is wrapping up. You are coming to the tail end of your time at Robin Hood. You have done quite a lot during your time. I want to ask later on as a last question what you're going to go next. But all of us as leaders running organization, we have our goals, we have our objectives and our aspiration. Is there something that you have wished you accomplished, but you really needed more time? Or is there a wish that you have for Robin Hood right now, just before you are leaving in May?
Wow. The list of things that I wish I could have accomplished is still very long, but actually it's one of the things that I think I'm hopeful for because we're still prepped to accomplish them. Robin Hood is at an extraordinarily strong point in the history of the organization, operationally, financially, in terms of connection with the community. I think our founder and our friend Paul Tudor Jones would say, this is the organization's at its strongest point in its 32-year history, and I'm really proud of that. I'm really proud of what this team has accomplished. But my hope for this organization is on these mechanisms that we have pushed forward on these mechanisms of really being able to understand and tackle the issue of racial inequity that exists within the United States, on the issue of being able to tackle how policy and policymakers have a distinct and important role in terms of solving this, that philanthropy will play a key role in this, but philanthropy has to understand that part of its key role means being a good partner to our governmental leaders who can then make better decisions when it comes to the usage and the allocation of our capital. And that we remain close to community. Every answer we are looking for, it's already there. Someone's saying it, someone's doing it. Our job is to unearth it. Our job is to find it and to accelerate it and blast it out. And so those are the things that I think, when I think about where this organization is just so set and primed to go, I'm so proud of where this organization is and what it's doing right now. And even as I move on to my next steps, I know that I'm going to be Robin Hood forever. And I know that the organization will continue doing remarkable work.
That's awesome. Your announcement, we got to know about you going to step down just shortly before the announcement came out. And yours is one announcement that is covered by the news in the US. But this is a Singapore call. Maybe it's a bit easier for me to ask this question. So what's next for you?
I'm still trying to figure it out. The thing that I know is, one, I will be a Robin Hood still for the next few months. And so we got a lot we got to get done before then. But the thing that I also know is, what's the old investment caveat that was put down? Like, past performance does not indicate future results. The things that I've worked on my whole life, the things that I've worked on at Robin Hood, these are the things I'm going to work on next. So past performance, is actually a pretty good indicator as to where I'm going to land and the kind of issues that I want to work on.
This is really cool. Hey, Wes, if there's one thing I can say with the bottom of my heart, a lot of what we are doing here at the Majurity Trust in Singapore, and by extent, the grantees and the donors we work with, has really been as a result of the inspiration of what you and your team has accomplished. I wish you the very best. Thank you so much in your last few months to agree to do this conversation with us. And there's so much to learn. And I hope that as we all settle with COVID, we can start traveling again, be it in New York, be it in Singapore. Thank you so much, my friend.
Bless you, brother. Thank you so much. And thank you all for all you continue to do. You inspire me, and I look forward to being your teammate for a very, very long period of time.
Thank you so much again, Wes. It's really good to have you. As many of you might actually have guessed, we're not doing a Q&A with Wes because the conversation we had was pre-recorded due to scheduling and time zone consideration. It is, after all, at the moment 4 a.m. in New York City. What we do have live, however, is our panel conversation with our esteemed panelists. Speaker Tan Chuan Jin, Ms. Anita Pham, President NCSS, Dr. John Lee, Country CEO and CEO Maybank Singapore, and Mr. Danny Yong, Founder and Chairman of the Majurity Trust, basically my boss, zooming in from Melbourne. Thank you very much, everyone, for really joining us for today. So just a brief mention of our time together. We'll start with a short opening remarks from each of our panelists, followed by a moderated conversation segment, and then we'll be taking questions from you, our Zoom audience. For everyone on Zoom, please feel free to ask any questions you might have to our panel on the question and answer tab, not the chat tab, but the question and answer tab, which I will have access via my iPad. Given that we will have over 200 participants and knowing how the questions will come in fast and furious, I ask that you keep your questions short and allow me as a moderator to combine a few similar questions from you and pose to the panelists. That way we can try to get to as much of the questions as we can with the time we have. Our theme for today is philanthropy, the way forward. A new world, a different world that we're getting used to post-COVID. How should and what can philanthropy be in this post-COVID world? We'll leverage a lot on what Wes is talking about. But even in this new world, I think we can continue with the tradition of ladies first. Anita, shall I ask you to start with the opening remarks?
Okay, thanks, Martin. You know, I was really blown away by Wes's sharing just now because it really talks about what philanthropy is all about. And to me, this last year, as I scanned back to what happened through the COVID age, it was, and I'll share that journey with you of NCSS, because when COVID first struck, one of the fears that we had was that our SSAs, our social service agencies, just wouldn't have the funds to continue. For a greater number of them, they had reserves of less than 3 months. And for some of them, they didn't have reserves beyond 12 months. So NCSS did a few things. We actually created a fund called the Invictus Fund, where it was, first of all, to help SSAs frontline COVID. And the other part of the fund was to really help them tide through that illiquidity and liquidity, that the challenges that they had. But on top of that, and this is what philanthropy is all about, we have to change gears from thinking of things from fundraising to really something that is of a more sustainable model. And that's what I really like the grant that was launched just now, because that's what it's all about. With the Invictus Fund, another tranche came in from government in about May last year. And it was another download of about $18.3 million on top of the $10 million that we got from the community, which makes it about $29 million to use. One part was to help frontline agencies in COVID. The other part was to help them sustain those who experienced a drop in donations. But the other part was really to build capability. A lot had to work from home. We had to actually encourage this digitalization journey and to provide the infrastructure and the funding for that. Beyond that is really capability for the sector in making organizations even stronger so that they can do what they do. So that for us is really the imperative going forward. How do we build the capability of our organization so that it can be more resilient, more able, more resilient, more sustainable going forward?
Thanks a lot, Anita. It is so crucial that we see beyond just money in philanthropy, right? There is that, I think speaker talked about it in the opening address, that experience that actually changes, the capacity building, the competency that we're building in the team and so on. So thanks for that. Yeah. Speaker, can I come to you next for your opening remarks?
Well, I think just a few points. One, I think we need to, one I would say is that while we are very much preoccupied with COVID-19 and it is in some ways, obviously, impacting us in a very significant way, not just in Singapore, but globally. But I think some of the fundamentals don't change just because it's COVID-19. So one is to be a lot more needs-driven. I think we need to understand what the needs are and to structure it that way rather than creating new things, this, that, the other. Obviously, sometimes new needs may be emerging, but I think to always be squarely focused on being needs-driven and sometimes building on things that are already there rather than reinventing the wheel. That's one. And tied to that is also being data-driven. I mean, we are developing as a smart nation. There's a lot of information out there that we need to be a lot more evidence-based rather than the look and feel of things. You see this happening, right? When you do crowdsourcing, for example, it's a very popular way of, getting online, tell a story. But is it true? Is it real? Yep. How do you triage between giving a whole chunk to one person or one entity and rather than splitting up between different agencies? And that's something that we need to balance off so that we can basically get the best bang for the buck and redirect limited resources the best way we can. Secondly, really is collaboration. I think all of us need to realize that we need to work together. Unfortunately, even in the social space, you will find that there will be, I guess, our own politics, people believing that my way is the best way, and everyone wanting their own freedom of action to do their own thing. The truth is, for us to be truly effective, we need to work together. So not just government, but I think civil society, the SSAs, the VWOs, the various organizations need to figure out how to come together, share information where we can, and collaborate. Don't reinvent the wheel, write on each other's programs, reinforce each other's work. And that's important. But just because you say it doesn't happen. I think you need to build up trust. So, you still need to spend time, to network, to have coffee together, things like that. But once trust is established, I think you begin to see things happening. And I think we need to see that happening on a much more extensive basis. And I guess lastly, the main message really is that I think in order for us to do preventive work, to go upstream, you really do need to leverage on, I guess, the broader masses. And in this area, volunteers can come in, I guess, individuals, drips and drabs. I'm particularly keen on corporates simply because, one, I think we need to, like in NCSS, we're funding volunteer managers because we know how difficult it is. And even with the volunteer managers, it's not easy to manage a lot of people coming on board, but it's still important. But I think that corporates offer a very powerful avenue from which individuals contribute, because we all work. And increasingly, companies are looking at a triple bottom line, doing good, etc. And they come with organizational structures. And if the leadership buys it and understand that this is something I can do, I can bring that organizational structure on board, and I can become a lot more regular, sustained, and structured. And I do see companies beginning to want to do things on a more regular, sustained basis, not just a once-a-year thing, but they have found meaning that actually their staff responding to it. Let's do this better. And imagine if most, if not all, companies come on board in a bigger way. I think there's actually a lot we can do. And I think I guess those are a few key points, which really is not unique to COVID, but it's something that's continued to, I think, remain important. And it's not beyond us, to organize ourselves that way, but we need to put in time to work that piece rather than just jump into it and just getting into doing things straight away.
And I think of our collective experience in 2020, of how people actually respond when they see the need. Often we do not want to wait until a crisis happens before we respond, right? And thereby your point about data, evidence-based, and if we can share that with donors and philanthropists, then maybe they say, hey, there is a need that I didn't see before. And I thought your point about bringing corporates on board is a great segue to Dr. John. It's been just a wonderful journey with Maybank to launch the Maybank Momentum Grant in a very, what we think, innovative and sustainable way. So, Dr. John, over to you for your remarks.
Thanks, Martin. I thought it may be appropriate for me to just share a little bit about, what is Maybank's giving philosophy. Some 10 years ago, after the global financial crisis, we saw the fallout of financial institutions. there was a lot of conversation around greed, around us not caring too much about others. We in Maybank decided that we needed to remind ourselves what we are here to do. And I think we came up with the mission of humanizing financial services. Obviously we talked about from an external perspective, but really to me it's an internal thing to remind our people, to remind our organization that I think as financial institution, we have a role to play in the better of society, not just making profits for our shareholders. So with that, I think as we journey through this last 10 years, we wanted to make sure our philanthropy work or giving to be more targeted and more specific outcome driven. It's very easy to give, I always say, but it's a lot harder to make sure that giving leads to an outcome that you particularly want. So again, 5 years ago, we started this portal called Maybank Heart, and that's in Malaysia. And the whole idea behind that was really not to get like crowdfunding, to get people contributing to some specific areas of things that they want to do. It could be as simple as a wheelchair for a disabled person, to a proper bed for elderly and so on. So it's very targeted, very specific outcome. And we thought by doing that, we are able to meet underserved areas. Giving, you can do a lot of things, but sometimes there's gaps in this, and therefore we wanted to do that. So I think that's generally the way we look at giving. And overall now, the approach that we want to take for our giving, is centered on three things. The first is around being relevant to our business. What I mean by that is that we want to make sure that our business has a role to play. It's not just coming, giving, and then there's no business relevance in that aspect. Second, it has to be strategic value add. So when we agree to do something, we want to make sure that there's actually a strategic outcome that whoever we give or whoever that receiving it has, can build on that outcome. And third, I think the most important I feel is the network effect. And what we mean by that is really getting our customers involved. It's not just us, and getting our customer involved and getting our employees involved. So take the Maybank Momentum Grant. We intend, as I said, to get our customers to contribute, but we also want to get our employees to be able to volunteer in some of this. So I think those are the way we look at it. So I think overall we want to try to be more specific, more outcome driven, and therefore really see the uplift that we really want to from this effort. Yeah.
And it's really cool to know that the bank also look at the individual interests of staff.
Yeah.
Right? Because a company is as strong as the team and the staff that they have. And if the culture of philanthropy agent reaches to the bottom denominator, so to speak, that every single staff is a philanthropist as part of the larger bank, there's a lot that companies can do just as a force for good to a certain extent. I thought it'd be good now to bring Danny in. Danny is zooming in from Melbourne. I say this not just because he's my boss. I say this because over the last few years working with him, I didn't know him before, but the way that he has looked at his approach to his giving is one that has helped us be able to do what we do. The willing to invest, the willing to say, hey, we need to do good, smart. We need to do like what he does in investments to see how capital can work for philanthropy. So Danny, over to you in Melbourne for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Speaker Tan Chuan Jin, Ms. Anita Pham, and Dr. John Lee. And thank you everyone for joining us at the Majurity Conversations, the way forward. And thank you, Maybank, for your generosity with the Maybank Momentum Fund. I'm so sorry I couldn't be there in person with all of you. Speaker Tan shared the secret to Singapore's success is our people. The Momentum Fund grantees clearly believe in paying it forward. Wes Moore so powerfully shared with us, how the Robin Hood Foundation changed his life. Clearly every little bit of help that we give today has unimaginable, longer-term impact on lives, right? It does make a difference, as Speaker Tan said, and as Wes said, make it matter. In 2008, in the midst of the financial crisis, a crisis very similar to the one that we faced just a year ago, a gentleman called Mr. Paul Tudor Jones, a hedge fund legend in New York City, and the founder of the Robin Hood Foundation, he gave me an opportunity to start my company, Diamond Asia. And today, also, because of the opportunity that Singapore has given me in terms of a great education, the job opportunities, I am financially comfortable, right? So I am here sitting here, essentially paying it forward as well. Like, so I think, and today in the COVID pandemic, Wes Moore again talked about who is it going to be tough on? Once again, I think the COVID pandemic and the bizarre K-shaped recovery that we have been seeing, where capital owners, technology companies have continued to gain, whereas the labor force is struggling, and at best muddling through. Right? Once again, the rich have gotten richer, but the poor continue to struggle. And I think those who so for us, whilst the unemployment rate continues to be high in many parts of the world due to the lockdown, but ironically, the stock markets and real estate prices continue to make all-time highs, around the world, including Singapore. I just Googled today, this word, which is the most capitalist country in the world. I was expecting to see, the US, United States, and then in terms of a city, I would think it would be New York City, right? But I was, surprised to find that, Hong Kong was the first, in terms of ranking for most capitalist country, and followed by Singapore. We were second. As an asset manager and an entrepreneur, I have to believe in capitalism, right? I've been rewarded, as such. I believe that capitalism, is an efficient allocation of resources. I believe in competition. I believe in the financial incentives, and more importantly, how capitalism spurs innovation and rewards innovation. But at the same time, I believe that capitalism is in dire need of reform, right? To level the playing field in favor of, the man on the street, labor, right? As the ever widening wealth gap is just unsustainable. I see the capitalism, the form of capitalism in Hong Kong. I term it Darwinian capitalism, right? Which in my view is unsustainable. Whereas in Singapore, I believe we need to work towards more of a different form of capitalism, or inclusive capitalism, right? I support personally higher taxes, especially for the rich. I support bringing back inheritance taxes in Singapore. I support the imposition of wealth taxes in Singapore. But that alone will not fix the structural inequalities in a capitalist system, right? So we've heard it's like New York City is like the most capitalist city in the world, and probably has the most billionaires in the world per capita. But yet half the population lives in poverty, right? So clearly increasing taxes is not going to be the solution alone. So to me, it's absolutely necessary, right? Because it helps with the redistribution, but at the same time, if we look around the world, right, most of the Western economies, including Japan, already have taxes at 50% and wealth taxes, close to 50%. But still, there is massive inequality and still a lot of people left behind, right? So, and that will lead ultimately to social unhappiness and sometimes social unrest, right? So for me, it's about, I started the Majurity Trust, with Martin Tan, essentially with the belief that, we need to build an inclusive and sustainable community, and country, right? But it cannot be left to any government to do it top down alone, right? We must build it from the bottoms up as well, right? We must pay it forward, with the belief that, it will be a virtuous cycle, right? So when each of us, just does that little bit to help a fellow Singaporean or a foreigner in Singapore who has fallen behind, right? Just that little action, to me, it's like, it's a way of, again, rather than, just donating cash alone, right? It's sort of like a way to show that we care, right? It's using our actions, and more than just our words. So we built the Majurity Trust on this belief, to be a platform that brings together Singaporeans, to help one another, in a more effective and efficient way using data and research, right? So the way forward, in my mind, is to pay it forward.
Thanks so much, Danny. Inclusive capitalist system. When we think about capital, the kind of resources that we have in our country, and this, like Danny says, is not just the Hong Kong system, but the Singapore system. We do extend that capital beyond just the investment side or the economic side. I think 2020, we have dipped into our reserves in a very significant way, and that came as a result of our capitalist policy to a certain extent. How do we actually stretch that going forward? Danny, I do want to come back to you, because beyond just the Majurity Trust, one of the things that you believe wholeheartedly is the collaborative approach to philanthropy. It's just not about the government alone. It's not just about companies alone. I know Diamond has our own CSR strategy, but it's just about working with people. You want to speak a little bit about your passion in bringing people to the table? How do you think that might be the way forward for philanthropy as a whole?
Sure. Again, if we use the Robin Hood Foundation in New York City as an example, right? Again, I think that was private individuals that saw an issue, that believed that, there were gaps that needed to be filled. And rather than, lobby the politicians or, write op-eds, to talk about how things are just, unsustainable or, just not right. For me, it's about taking action, right? However small it may be, right? So it's about us from the bottoms up, looking for ways to essentially help one another to fill that gap, because it's almost impossible from a top-down broad brush. It's like a government can only do, sort of like will be able to make policies that can scale, but it will never help, never change the fact that little, individuals are still going to fall through the cracks. So for me, it's about building a collaborative environment where private philanthropists and individuals, right, essentially, because we are only answerable to ourselves, essentially, where we are able to fund a lot quicker a lot of these needs, right? So as in, we are able to experiment, based on and actually collect data from the research to decide, where do we want to try to channel, the resources, and be it financial or as well as actual, volunteer help into. Right? So for me, it's the bottom-up approach, privately funded, will work, very well in tandem with what the nonprofit sector, and the government is already doing right now, right? So again, I think traditionally, in Singapore, and I'm guilty of that as well, that there is a habit of essentially always assuming that, if a fellow Singaporean or fellow person in Singapore has fallen through the cracks, it's the government's fault, right? So the government should have known better, basically, why isn't the government fixing this, right? I found myself doing that as well, some years ago, right? But at the same time, this is our home. What stops us from basically stepping out to basically help one another, right? So for me, the collaboration is about, like we all see the gaps, right? And some of us are better at fundraising, some of us are better, basically with connecting to the ground and where the gaps are, to the beneficiaries. So it's just that, I'm hoping that, if we work more closely together, right, that we can start to fill more of these gaps so that Singaporeans that are kind of falling behind feel that at least there is more care, right? So that it will lead to a more inclusive and sustainable society, where it strengthens the fabric, right, from the bottoms up.
That's our experience last year with SG Strong, when we launched the fund in February. It's really as a result of seeing the ground responding to that crisis, right? We started seeing all the different pockets of young people. Actually, not just young people. Our data come back. There are people in their 30s, in their 40s, just wanting to do something about it. It was heartening to see and to be able to pull the resources together. We have 10 donors that gave about $500,000 for SG Strong Fund, and we saw that growing. Speaker, I thought it'd be good to ask you, because SG Cares is about that. It's really about the rallying of the ground and the troops together to say, you know what, we all have an ownership, we all have a part to play. What would be your response?
I think 2 points. I think one, this thing about mobilizing the ground, as being in government before and an MP on the ground, my own conclusion is that like today, for example, MSF, we are forward deployed SSO. You have your FSC, the Family Service Centers, then you have your Silver Generation Office. So we have a lot more agencies deployed forward, which is really useful. But the last mile is where we are on the ground, the community, where we live, the grassroots. And I personally believe that I think unless the government really recruits extensively and everything, everything do, I don't think it's actually possible for the government to be able to fill every single gap. I don't think it's practically possible, because I think when you systematize it, even at a certain level, even with the forward deploy elements, I'm very active on the ground with my volunteers on the ground. I believe that we play a very important role. One, I think, firstly, because I don't think it's actually quite possible to be able to do that, because the number of people you need to recruit and so on is just phenomenal. But I think secondly, for the simple reason, you're going to lose something in the process. When everything is, you hire people to do it. The community plays a part, the civil society plays a part, and really it's about collaboration so that we fill the gaps. The government has, to be honest, a lot of programs available. A lot of money is being put aside. Social spending is increasing in a massive way. But the feelers to pick up issues, to do preventive work, once I go upstream, I'm basically trying to anticipate and in a way activate your safety nets or your trampolines. And I don't actually want to activate that. I don't want them to fall. But to go upstream, actually, I need more hands and legs to help assist the trained staff, whether you're social workers, your SSO officers, to be able to do what they do. And that's where the volunteers come in. So SG Cares really is about, it's not so much a top-down movement, it's really the whole notion that all of us play a part to care for each other. And it's empowering because I really don't need to wait for government. I can play a part in my own capacity as a grassroots member, in a SSA, or wherever it may be. So I think it's really important because I said it helps us fill the gaps, it helps us pick up information, and then again linking back up to the systemic help that we're able to provide, whether through ComCare, through financial assistance of various forms, and then of course we can complement it with other funds raising. That's one part. Secondly, is a bit more philosophical, sort of response to a point made earlier, which is I think it's a popular thing that we talk about inequality. And honestly, we need to ask ourselves we use these terms, but I'm not sure whether we necessarily all have the same mental picture and perspectives. So let's say you measure a Gini coefficient. You look at of course, with the K-shaped recovery, there are people who are making a lot more money, and the gap between the very top and the very bottom might be wider. But does that necessarily mean that people were not uplifted? The story of Singapore is that we sometimes talk as if we are regressing as a society. I'll give an example. In the army, we used to have Hokkien Pings in our combat units. Today, don't have Hokkien Pings, or very, very few. Not because we discriminate and don't recruit them, because I just don't have Hokkien Pings. You don't drop out of school pre-O levels. You actually carry on ITE, go higher NITEC, go to poly. There's a lot more avenues to bring people on. And we have uplifted a whole generation. And many of us in our generation weren't necessarily from better backgrounds. But your middle class is now chock-a-block full because you've been up. So the mobility is there. Now, what has happened is that for those who are disadvantaged, it makes it harder for you to break into that space because it's a lot more filled up than it was, say, 2 decades ago, right? And at that stage, Singapore is developing as well. There's a lot of opportunities as well. So in a way, it's a function of success in uplifting. And I think it's very important that we conduct that conversation so that you don't throw away the baby out of the bathwater because, meritocracy is a bad thing, capitalism is a bad thing. Well, it has also, certainly in our context, uplifted many out of poverty, brought many into the middle class, provided mobility to a lot of families and individuals who otherwise would not have had in any other society. But now is how do you moderate that situation because you now have a very large group? Because my fear with this conversation is I won't say it's populist, but it's very easy to get, oh, it's bad. So what does it mean? Do you drag the top down? Do you tax more? As it is, our taxation system today in Singapore, the bulk of the taxes are actually paid for by the top 20% or so. Right? So how far do you want to go? Does it affect competitiveness, the competition for talent? And whether does that eventually also impact your overall growth? And whether that growth actually provides for example, at the lower income level, wages have grown actually proportionally higher, right, in percentage terms more than upper because of the uplifting of the economy. So this is something I've just put out for all of us to think about because I think it's important for us to, look at it and see how actually has it translated in real life. Perhaps the Gini coefficient may be wider than it has been ever before. But in material terms, have we uplifted a lot more people out of, say, a more disadvantaged position into a better position? But what is very clear, and which is why we need to apply ourselves today, is that those who are disadvantaged will find it harder to break out. Yeah. And how do you then intervene? How do you go upstream? That's where the work in early childhood comes in a massive way. And that's where I think there's a lot of things we can do to try to break the cycle for some of these folks.
And also the needs do change, right? I think as we progress, as we uplift, if we think in percentage, we will always have our bottom 10, 20%.
It depends on how you define it. Right?
Exactly.
There will always be that.
And the kind of needs and the kind of gaps might be as a result sometimes of policy or indirect consequences, or just sometimes, the world has changed. Certain jobs that people are trained for now no longer are the same. Therefore, they find themselves completely out of the equation. And I think one of the key things is how do we, both in the social sector, as companies, government, philanthropists, philanthropic organizations, when we look at challenges and issues, how do we best surface? I like what Wes said in his keynote, right? That sometimes the people who are closest to the problem are best placed to come up with the solutions. So at NCSS, that's one of the things that we are trying to do to actually support more of how do we get our social service agencies closer to the ground. Anita, I thought I can come to you to talk a little bit about.
Yeah, a lot of it is mindset shift. One being that if we become person-centric, as opposed to program-centric. So that's one major shift that we need to do. In the past, how we've funded things is programs. But if we look at the needs of a person, which are far more complex, and it's not slice and dice so easily, I think we need to change our mindset. So there are a few things that I think we need to think about. One being person-centric as opposed to program-centric. The other thing is to shift from that thinking of fundraising to philanthropy. Yeah. Philanthropy being a far broader ecosystem of thinking. Rather than traditional grants, it really is, and I love this Momentum Fund because that recyclable nature empowers people. They receive the funds, they're empowered, and they pay it forward. And that is the shift that we need to have going forward. The need for data analytics, very, very important. We need to be evidence-based. We really, especially to make ourselves more efficient in how we give. Because what we're dealing with here is social capital. And we need the efficiency of the capital markets in the social service sector, which we don't quite have. So that is where we need to build up capability of the people who are in the sector. And one more thing is that I think we have to shift from that mindset of being organizationally centric to one being system-centric. So even in terms of the role of philanthropy, it's no longer in the domain of the government grant makers or just in individuals, but really an whole ecosystem. And you mentioned, John, just now about for this Momentum Fund, how you are planning to get your staff involved, how you're planning to get your customers involved. And I believe that is the philosophy we should have going forward.
The one thing that I will remember in 2020, and to your point, it's how we change our mindset to see things differently. And you felt compelled personally to seed and start the Invictus Fund because you sort of saw it on a systemic basis to say, we can't just do things in one way now. We just can't support one organization. What can we do? So maybe, do you mind if you share a little bit about your experience in seeding the Invictus and how that grew to where government funding came in and now become a very cornerstone fund during this time?
Yeah, it was mind-blowing, Martin. I never imagined when I started it, I messaged my CEO in NCSS and said, I think we need to help our members. Because at that point in time, I think the third iteration of our budget had come out, and it was for SMEs, but there was nothing then for charities. And I said, we need something for our members. And that's how it started, very modestly. But I think it resonated with a lot of people because it was the elements in it wasn't just, the elements were helping others. So it was frontlining agencies in that COVID storm. It was rescuing agencies who were really in a bind because they had lost their lifeline to donations. And then thirdly, which government came in, and that was to make ourselves even better and stronger. And that was a capability building. So that was the investment for the future. And for me, these are the elements which are so important for ourselves going forward. And so when I look back on that year, and you've heard the adage, never waste a good crisis. I really felt that COVID was a wonderful opportunity for us to change the way we approach things and to change our mindsets and to actually force good change for us, as painful as it was.
I like about the development and the scaling up of that, right? I mean, if you think about if I use our SG Strong in February 2020 as an example, and then to Invictus as well, it came as a result from the ground. People who are close to the ground, who see the issues, the lack, while instead of just waiting and complaining about it, like what Danny was talking about, but what can we do? So we pull donors together. And then when things start gathering momentum, in SG Strong with a specific ground-up initiative, it was a very hard space, right? Because we are really betting on individuals who say, we trust you, but you are closest to the crowd, come up with the ideas, we'll support you. And with the result came Temasek coming in with Oscar at SG. There's a building of that. And the same thing with Invictus. It started with you, and then with NCSS, and then the government said, hey, there is a strong way going forward with this. Let's invest a little bit more. I sort of saw the parallel and said, wow, actually it's a really good dynamics that will come out of that. Maybank is an example as well. To see an innovative idea, it was quite scary because it's not something that's been done. So, Dr. John, from your perspective, as a corporate leader, as well as someone who's really passionate about the sector, what went through your mind when we think about doing something that responds to the ground, but perhaps changing our mindset and an innovative way of doing it?
So I think what attracted us to wanting to fund this was the fact that, obviously, as it's indicated, recyclable. In that sense that we want to be able to come in to assist. I use the word. All these smaller charities are a bit like a startup, right? If you think about startup, you want to nurture them, you want to build them, you want to create them, make them to be more sustainable. Once they are able to do that, shareholders get paid, right? Or the next series come in, or depending on which cycle it is. So I think we saw it in a similar way, and because as a bank, obviously we see things in that way. It was quite natural that this is a good way to support charities, and therefore this whole idea of recyclable was very appealing. And what I also like of the fact is that we and working with Majurity Trust is really going around ground to understand what are the smallest issues that people are dealing with. And I think the 3 grantees that I really want to hear their stories about. What specifically they are doing that maybe others are not. And I think we want to just continue to do that and find those gaps and find those smaller things that people can do. Like I say, any startup that is trying to solve very, very small problems. So I think that really what attracts us to this whole thing.
How was the rallying cry within Maybank itself when you announced internally? Is it like, because the CEO says so, everybody's got to do it, or it's something that actually you feel rallied the troops?
I mean, when we talk about our giving philosophy, I like to. I think it is still a challenge for many organizations in the sense that how do you translate from a top-down idea to get people excited about it? And how we saw it was really getting them involved. That's the only way you can translate from a top-down idea to getting people from the bottom up appreciating and wanting to do it. Until you roll your hands, your sleeves, so to speak, and get your hands dirty, you wouldn't appreciate it. If you don't get engaged with some of these people, you don't know what some of the issues are. So I think that was important for us to always look at the angle of how can we get our employees involved, so you get the bottom up, the ground up kind of support.
For philanthropists, for donors in particular, within the larger philanthropy landscape, we often live with this baggage of sort that, we want to fund programs. And then, Anita, to your point, right? We just want to fund programs. We don't want to fund overhead costs. We don't want to fund manpower. We just really want the program to work well. What do you think are the best ways to change from that mindset? Because we realize that it is important to have good people within the sector. We realize that it's important to see more than just the programs, but the system as a whole. Anita, you want to share a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think the two things we need to redefine: our understanding of social capital and our understanding of social return. I was one of those in the beginning. When I came back from studies in late 1980s, I said I wanted to donate to a charity where the money went just to the beneficiary. But it never occurred to me until many years later that for it, you need a well-run organization in order to really ensure that the beneficiary gets the best. So we need to fund operating costs, and that's the social capital. We actually have to make sure that our organizations are really well-run, efficiently run, professionally run, and really capable. And the other thing is, how do we define that success? That measurement of impact going forward is really, really important. Is it the job creation? Is it lifting someone from a poverty line? There are many things. Is it ensuring that a kid continues staying in school? What is it that we want to do? And we have to be very clear about articulating that. It's not clear. My quest for clear social impact measurement still continues to this day.
Yeah. It's a holy grail in the social sector, or to have one standardized. At Majurity Trust, we're coming slowly to the conclusion that there isn't one key measure, but rather a series of proxies that we can use. And probably that's one of the biggest takeaway I had when I spent time with Wes and the team in New York, is to develop a whole series of proxy indicators that we can straddle across different issues. And if we collectively, across board, on a collaborative way, build this knowledge base, a set of indicators that we can all use to measure, then I think the sector is better off to a certain extent. I want to bring Danny, because I think, Anita, you talked a little bit about how you also changed personally, right? That beyond just program is about teams and so on, and how to bring people to the table. To a certain extent. The way we do it at Majurity Trust, 100% of what we raise from our donors goes directly to the causes and the charities and the ground-up group we work with. The only reason why we can do that is because Danny and the board has committed to support our operating costs. And I really thought that was a very progressive way of thinking, something that we learned from Robin Hood. Danny, if I can bring you back in, can you share from your perspective as a founder in this, I think, progressive way of looking at support? Instead of giving your money to another charity for a particular work, you're trying to see how can we build a Majurity Trust, a philanthropy organization that multiplies that money. I thought it would be a good time to bring you in to talk a little bit about what you had in mind.
Thanks, Martin. Then I have to go back to when we first started in 2012. I think many of us, we see gaps, right? Either gaps as opportunities in business or gaps, just in daily life where you feel things could be done better, right? So then the key, back in 2012, there were certain situations that you read about people falling through the cracks in Singapore. And then the challenge back then, when crowdfunding wasn't, that popular, and there weren't that many places to go, was how to get the funds, because Singaporeans are very, very generous, right? And when people fall through the cracks and when you read about stories in the papers, you will love to just dip into your pocket and maybe just help them with, $50. But it was challenging back in 2012 and there wasn't really a platform, right? So we started off at that point to say, how do we build, a trustworthy platform that could actually help all the generous donors in Singapore get funds to the beneficiaries who need it, in a way that would be very accountable and trusted, right? So that's where we first started, and it says, since it doesn't exist, let's build it, right? So rather than just lament that, oh, it doesn't exist, it should exist, or I wish somebody built it, we decided, why don't we build it ourselves? And to speaker's point about mobility, I absolutely believe that we have come a long way, and it's a great thing, and it's not about pulling down the top, but it's about how to help the bottom to basically break through, some of that, out of the poverty cycle. And success very often is about opportunity, right? So in 2016, we decided and just felt, if everyone is hiring just based on the grades that you have, whereas they should be hiring also based on your skills and your traits, and your qualities, right? More than just your grades. So we decided at that point that we needed to try to change the mindsets of hiring, and in the companies, including our own, and use a psychometric testing as a way of hiring based on the qualities and traits that were needed for respective roles, right? So we started the Tangent Initiative at that point. And also at that same time, initially when Martin and I worked together, it was actually to fund the Yong Hong Kong Foundation, right? My family foundation. But then I thought, since we're going to do all this work to do philanthropy, in a more data-driven, way, why don't we do it together, right? It's like, why do we just build this platform for one foundation? Why don't we just open source it and such that anybody who wanted to do good, who was willing to collaborate could do it together, right? Because we're really going to put in the investment anyway, right? So, it was all about the people bringing together, quality, high standards, of ways to basically measure social impact, right? As Anita talked about, right? And that's something that we continue to focus on, right? Basically learning from, the Robin Hood Foundation and other organizations around the world, and doing it in our own way, more transparent, accountable, and a very, very open platform. And now as we get more and more traction, and more social entrepreneurs that have a lot of different ideas, now from the bottom up, as Martin talked about, and all these ideas are things that we would never have thought of on ourselves, but they may be short of certain funding, or they may not have the network and connectivity that, some of us on this panel do. Then the key is, how do we work together with them, to help to galvanize or seed some of these ideas and see where it goes, So SG Strong in a way had seeded a lot of these ideas, and some are actually evolving into charities, into social enterprises, and then we continue to collaborate, right? And I think the Maybank Momentum Fund as well, it will be more of an acceleration fund. So to me, it's exactly like investing, right? So there's the venture stage, there's the acceleration stage, and at a certain point when it gains so-called breakout velocity, then it goes off on its own and hopefully able to repay. And then we continue to have that paying it forward, and then the virtuous cycle, right? So it's not about, kind of like any one foundation or anybody taking any credit. It's just about how do we work together to fill the gaps better together.
The way we call it is collaborative philanthropy. How can people come to the table together and do it together? And one of the things that Danny was talking about is, whenever we see a gap, how can we actually bring about ground-up resources, ideas, philanthropic resources together and say, hey, let's tackle it together, if there is the gap. Technology plays a part, and for our Zoom audience, I've been going through the questions, so I'm going to wrap some of the questions they are asking in the conversation that we are having. We talk about technology, we talk about data. How we can use that with analytics to surface gaps that we otherwise don't see. And Speaker, you've talked about GovTech being a big play in this. One of the challenges in the sector is the availability of data. What do you think we can do to really collaborate? We are bound to a certain extent by PDPA, so we recognize that. we also recognize that sometimes government's data, for example, it's rightly so, sometimes not shareable. But we do need some of this data to be able to really reach the ground where the needs are. If, as an advice maybe to us in the philanthropic space, how best can we collaborate across board with NCSS as agencies, with social sector, with philanthropies on the ground, as well as with government, to be able to leverage on technology and data in a way that we can do good?
So officially, I think PDPA gets in the way, unfortunately. For good reason, PDPA exists. So that's something even between government agencies, we are also talking to see how to streamline it, because if you follow it strictly, there's a lot of things that becomes a bit more difficult. But if we get the individuals to pre-sign and to give consent, it makes it a lot easier. So I think with technology, I think increasingly we can, frankly, you can pick up a lot of things. For example, in the ideal world, although it's kind of scary as well, imagine if someone is not able to pay his town council fee, so that's an indicator of sort of financial duress, and then his childcare fees also having some arrears. But when you have imagine you have a mega dashboard where every individual is featured. But like I said, that's why it's kind of scary, right? And then it's like, oh wait, there's an amber light blinking, because no one person sees all these different data points, right? In an extreme world, then that becomes every individual is there, and then you know that even before there's a problem, you step in and do it. Now, obviously, that's kind of scary, right? I think that opens up a whole new dimension, but it's also a bit philosophical in that, do you actually want to preempt every single thing? Or do we also bear responsibility? Look, when something doesn't quite work, trigger, and then there's a process. So in a way, you don't, while I say that you don't want to do preventive work, but at the same time, there is a place that sometimes is not the most efficient, but things get triggered and get picked up. That's one. Secondly, even with whatever existing data we ever picked up and with the PDPA, I can draw my wire diagrams of who should share this. Frankly, if trust doesn't exist, it doesn't work.
Yes.
And this is where I will say that even with PDPA, frankly, if you spend time, drink coffee together, go out makan, you build up relationship, if you're Chamsiong, not PDPA, not supposed to share, but okay, I share with you. Okay, honestly, yes, there'll be this, but this is where I think relationships and trust plays a very big part as well. So that even while we try to sort it out formally and just to qualify, I'm not saying that you can violate PDPA, but I'm just saying...
I thought you might want to just caveat that a bit.
I think when we are able to build relationships and when trust is built, life is all about risk management, right? You don't do anything wrong, then don't do anything. But you want to do something good, I think when there's a level of trust, I think you can push boundaries, be creative where you can. And while we try to formally also try to establish protocols so that we streamline it as much as is possible. So even within whatever space we have today, the truth is, if we are able to build up relationships, we are able to build up trust, we all can risk manage accordingly. And I think there are ways that, I'm sure all of you out there on the ground, you know what I'm talking about. We all manage, but certainly data is really, really powerful. But we also need to, I guess, adjust the accompanying protocol so that we also allow ourselves some leeway to use them judiciously.
Talking about risk and trust, how building trust is hard. Tearing it down is very easy. It's one of those inverse relationship thing. What can we do in the sector to be able to build trust across, both with the corporates, with the agencies, with government? Sometimes when we want to be innovative, we say, we have slept on our wrist. Oh, actually, you cannot do that. Which is why we found Maybank to be a wonderful partner, because, hey, we're going to go in together to try. What do you all think are the best ways for us to de-risk to a certain extent? And maybe private philanthropy have a way to help government de-risk so that we can actually do more. And I will come to Dr. John in a bit, because I know from Dr. John's perspective, we talked about this as well. Where does risk come in from a corporate standpoint? And where does risk come in government standpoint? So Anita, maybe I'll come to you. What do you think we can do to be able to invest in building this trust and the ability to have the buffer to de-risk innovative ideas?
I think, first of all, our sector is a very, very risk-averse sector, overly risk-averse. And it's a change-averse sector. We don't like change and we don't like risk. COVID made us change, so that was quite a good thing. But how do we take more risks? First of all, I think we need to think beyond ourselves. We like to do good, and we like to do good under the umbrella of our organizations. But to work with others, beyond that, that's really hard. And here, I think it's first of all changing that mindset that we need to de-silo, unsilo the space that we're in, to be more open to working with others. And others meaning it could be another social service agency, it could be a corporate, it could be a philanthropist, but is to be far more open to doing things differently and approaching the challenges in a different sort of way. And I think philanthropy has a space because if you think about it, philanthropy is the risk capital in our sector. And they can move more swiftly, react more quickly to the challenges on the ground, as opposed to the more cumbersome governmental machinery that there is. So I think there's a place for all, but we need to be open to working together.
Corporates will have a slightly different challenge when it comes to risk, right? Because you do have shareholders, you have stakeholders to answer to with your shareholders' earning calls and so on. So, Dr. John, what do you think? How can we actually do this collectively?
If you allow me to just maybe backtrack and talk about data, I think one of the issues around data is I think in this area we're actually not clear what we mean by data yet. I think we need to try to bucket them and say what is the data that we want. As you earlier pointed out about the fact that do we want to measure outcome? How do we do that? What's the data we need? And then to Speaker Tan's point about understanding what's on the ground is a separate kind of data. So I think that's something that we need to think about from a data. There are some that we need to be better in collecting. There's some PDPA issue, but so I think that's the further. Now you're right in the sense that I think even as we were looking at the people who applied for the grants, we were really thinking about what's the, if we support this, what's the message people will get about this and things like that. So I think to address that, really, we need to get information, data again, to really understand on the ground what each of these charities are trying to do, what are they trying to achieve. And through that process, we can de-risk. I think a lot of the risk is overlaid too much from the top down to say, as an organization, we just don't want to do this. But we don't go down to the ground to understand enough, and I think that's important. And then that's where data comes in and say, look, actually, this is what they're doing, this is what exactly, and therefore we can manage the risk, or at least it allows us to de-risk. And document it from our organization. We need to document, we need to have the governance say, this is what is being done, and hopefully that helps in that process. But I think we don't go down to the ground. That's why we have this very, at the high level, overly managing the risk unnecessarily.
The thing about going to the ground is such an important one because data is only data. The ability for us to build trust is the relationship that we get to know with people. One of the things that the team really enjoys at Majurity Trust is the relationship they have with the grantees. You can ask questions, you can ask honest questions because once they know you enough, they don't feel judged. I mean, like we are asking all these questions, are you saying that we're doing badly? No, they realize that we're trying to make sure that things work. Speaker, how, in your opinion, trust and de-risk?
So I think I'm more traditionalist in that sense. I think people need to spend time with each other. I mean, to cultivate the relationship. It's like business, right? I mean, and trust is exactly the word. I mean, how do you build up trust? It's about relationships. It's when you interact with each other, you get to know each other and try to strip down whatever facade we all may have. And like I said, you can draw the wire diagrams you want about all the collaborations you want. It's not going to work just because you mandate it that way. The people-to-people contact. And it's so like what I do on the ground, for example, I pull the government agencies, FSCs, sitting together, they're in the community, but because no choice. As MP ask them to come, they bopian got to come. Then they come a few more times, they share WhatsApp group, they go for makan. Actually, today things are moving and a lot of things are getting on. They don't even invite me, sometimes they feel, we're doing this, I feel kind of left out. But it's really great because you're not now just calling HDB, I'm not just calling the FSC, I'm calling someone who I know. And it's very different. And people begin to take ownership because there's a shared perspective, there's a shared passion. So I think you can't run away from just building relationships. And I think that's something that, it applies to business, it applies to the social sector as well. Another point about risk I want to highlight really is also about the kind of society we live in with social media and everything. So I give an example of child protection work where, our child protection officers, you go in too late, then you get criticized. Why you come in so late and the child get abused? Going too early, how are you so disruptive? You break up families. And then the public become judge and jury because people play it up for various reasons. Sometimes with good intent, sometimes not, but it creates a lot of pressure, and then you become really wary because the public is scrutinizing, I'm sure the commercial side as well, any slightest thing that goes on, and with the cancel culture coming in a big way, we're all fearful. And sometimes easier to don't do anything. Or when something goes wrong, you feel compelled to overcompensate and do something. Sometimes that is the wrong answer. I mean, now with the audit that you have every year, it's not because people are dishonest, you're not following the rules. So our solution is create more rules. But maybe you deregulate and you'd have less of these things that trip you up. But the public plays a role because the more they respond and hold you to judgment for every mistake, and mistakes will be made, and then it actually creates a more risk-averse culture, whether in commercial sector or the social sector. So I think what we need to do, for the leadership is to give confidence to the team that you're able to weather it. But secondly, I think, which is to accept to me, I think you're just going to accept the fact that society is going to be like that. It's not going to get better. With social media, it's just going to go down going down a particular path, right? It brings out the worst in people. But I think there are things you can do, and one of the things that I feel very strongly about is we're not telling enough stories. Basically, to inoculate. Crisis management, when a crisis happens, you deal with it. The emotions are heated up, very hard to communicate and get points across. But in the peacetime, all the good that you do, as you share the stories, as you get the message out, sometimes we don't see that as important, but I think it is because you're inoculating, you're helping people understand, you're humanizing organizations. Hopefully that will buy you that space and that sort of generosity of spirit that people are prepared to afford you when the crisis happens. Because you know where it's going to go, but if you don't prepare for that, I think you're going to be stuck with a very difficult situation. And that's something that the social sector, we don't always talk often enough, but I do feel that we need to actually sell the stories more. Not just because of this, but at the same time as you're selling stories, you're also inspiring others to come on board and do something. So that's something to, think about to help manage risk as well.
And for us, when you think about selling our stories, it is beyond what Wes was talking about, the cutest kid on the annual report. But it is really the inspiration that people are doing things on the ground. And where at least at the macro level and at the grantee level.
And you're recognizing the individuals, you're celebrating them, making them feel proud of who they are. And I think that's something we could also do. It's internal engagement as well.
And it inspires fellow men. It inspires society as a whole. When we think about what philanthropy and the way forward, we have covered quite a fair bit. But I like the way that we're ending. It wasn't scripted this way, but we really ended, I think, on what is important to us, which is that the work that we do can inspire each other. Data is an important, technology is an important aspect. We need metrics to measure so that we know where the outcomes are. But behind every number is a story. Behind every good is a hero that we don't know about. It could be just our neighbor. And behind every door could be a family that gaps we don't see. They fall through a crack that we don't realize. And the ability for us to collaboratively work together will make a lot of difference. Like all good things, time is always our enemy. I hope you have enjoyed this panel. I hope you've enjoyed being here as well. Can I ask everyone to give a virtual round of applause to our panelists, Speaker Tan Chuan Jin, Anita, Dr. John, and Danny from Melbourne. Thank you so much. There's so much to cover, and we hope that we can continue to journey with you in different parts and different aspects of the work we do for the ground. Thank you so much. Charlotte, back to you.
Thank you, Martin, Speaker, Anita, Dr. John, Danny, all of you who are joining us online, and also a big thank you to Ox Media for this incredible set that we are on today. Now, as promised, if you want to find out more about the grant or the grantees, please do scan the QR code that you see on your screen right now. Thank you once again for being part of the Majurity Conversations 2021. Take care and stay well.